This episode is brought to you in part by Samply. Samply makes the process of dealing with mix revision notes super easy. Make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And while you're there, get 3 months off any plan free by simply using the coupon code MYM at checkout. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Rob Chiarappa, and if you're not familiar with him, he is an award-winning songwriter, engineer, producer. He has worked with artists like The Story So Far, Mulligan, Mom Jeans, Midtown, and a whole bunch more. And in today's episode, we talk a lot about the concept of taking a song from being like an iPhone demo to becoming a full-blown production. And that is something that Rob does a lot of with his productions. He really enjoys the songwriting side of production and working with artists to help flesh out those ideas and ultimately make songs turn out the best way that they can. And so in this episode, we talk a lot about the concept of like dissecting a demo and finding the gold in those demos. We talk about what to do when you get an artist that comes to you with just a bare bones idea, something like a guitar and a vocal. You know, how do you then turn that idea into a much bigger full-blown production? We also talk about Rob's mental checklist for how he analyzes tracks and then works through producing them in the best way and assessing things like tempo and keys and finding the pocket of tracks and instrumentation decisions, all that kind of stuff. So if you're the type of person who really enjoys the songwriting side of things, or if you're someone who is working on your own material, but you don't necessarily know how to produce your own music, like it's hard, you find it hard to have an objective opinion about your music, I think this episode is going to be really helpful because it's going to give you a lot of insight into what a songwriter or producer would do to a track and how to, ultimately turn it from an idea, a rough idea, into something that is full-blown and sounds awesome. So with that said, let's just jump right into this episode. Rob Chiarappa, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. What's going on, dude?
Of course, not much. Just feeling good.
Right on. For people who might not be familiar with you and, you know, who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into music production, can you give us that background?
For sure. I am a songwriter and producer from New Jersey. I work out of 2 studios, Barber Shop Studios in Hopatcong, New Jersey, and Dim Studios down in Freehold. I've been doing this since I was 16 years old. Started, like a lot of people do in their parents' basement, with a couple of 57s. Been doing it now for the better half of those 15, 16 years. And every day it's just an adventure, whether it's working with a pop artist or working with a rock band, there's always a different, way of going about it. So
that's awesome. What ultimately got you into playing music to begin with?
So in high school and middle school, just playing a lot of local bands. And I remember the summer of 8th grade, me and my band at the time, we saved up dollar money, played all like the local block parties and whatnot. And we wanted to record our first demo. At the time, I just had a little 2-channel interface and like guitar rig one. It was Cubase LE. I saw there was a professional recording studio, about 15, 20 minutes away. And being a teenager, I saw that they had orange guitar amps. And to me, all the bands I liked had an orange amp. That's the reason I wanted to go there. So called the studio up on the phone, and we were just a local pop punk band. And called the studio up on the phone, and I'm like, hey, I wanted to, book time to record a couple songs for my band, knowing nothing about it, going into it blindly. And studio owner was like, yeah, like what kind of music is it? I'm like, oh, like pop punk music. And he was like, oh, like the Ramones? And I was like, no, like a little more current. And he's like, oh, like the Fall Out Boys. And I was like, yeah, I guess like that. We live tracked, and as 15-year-old kids, we all sucked at our instruments, and we got the stuff back. And I was like, we went to this beautiful room, and, we didn't know the process, right? And I was like, why did this sound like I didn't like it as much as the demo I did at home, which I knew nothing about, I was going into a little interface. I was probably clipping things to know tomorrow, but I think it was just from okay, I know what I wanted to sound like. I don't really know how to get there. And from there, I kind of, had my parents had a PC desktop in the basement. That was like the family computer. And down there, that's where I had my, TV set up at the time. And I kind of would just go on YouTube religiously and just watch videos and, fake. I remember I would even program drums in, the Guitar Tab software, Guitar Pro?
Guitar Pro, yeah.
I would like write out the MIDI in there and then bring it into like some weird old like contact instrument. And I remember my first ever client that wasn't my own band was senior in high school. I had a rapper in my math class who was like, yo, like I've been seeing you put stuff up on MySpace. You know, do you have a place to record? I have like some like YouTube beats. Can I come over and record? So I remember like being all excited going home, like, Mom, I got my first like recording client. Went down there and it was kind of like my way of just making like extra cash in high school, working my high school retail job. And it was also my way of just really getting my bearings, learning it. Like from there, like I went to a really big high school, 4,000 kids in my school. So,
Oh, wow.
and at the time, this is, 2009, 2010. So it was the pinnacle of like, later MySpace, early Facebook bands. Like, so every kid with neon green skinny jeans in high school was like, oh, well, that guy, Rob, he has a place we can go and record. And it'd be like, so it became kind of a way where that's where I got my start, got my bearings. I was tracking drums at the time. I had two SM57s. I put on a kick and snare. And those I was using for overheads. I had these D-drum red shots. They're these, I don't know if you remember them, these terrible little like triggers. You'd hit it once and maybe you'd do like, you would grab it for like 3 notes or you would just miss notes. But that was kind of like my way of like figuring it out. And, from there, any money I would get was just buying more gear. And eventually, I was in a band called The Stolen. We were like a pop rock band. Did some touring with that band and did that for the greater half of up till maybe, I would say 2019. And while I was doing that, when I'd be home, I was either still working on my parents' house. And then I had my own kind of like DIY studio up in North Jersey for a bit. That was, I think, the first thing that had a little bit of, for lack of a better word, like traction for me. Like I remember like one of our singles like got the New Music Friday. And I remember that was like the first thing that kind of had some sort of like merit and started getting some of the smaller label projects and things like that. And even recently, once I think COVID hit, I was doing a bit of work out of Barber Shop Studios, which is where I still work out of now. And my friend Brett Romness works out of that room as well. He works with like those bands like Mom Jeans and Hot Mulligan. And him and his wife were expecting their, first kid. And he was like, hey, like, I'm going to need some help on these projects. I'm, not going to be able to be around as much, I'm going to have a newborn. So started helping him on some of those projects. And from there, just kind of, it's been a bit more at Barber. And this studio I'm in now, just opened also like 2021. My brother and my manager, Matt, actually started opening this place. And when Brett is super booked at Barber and he's got a band there for 2 months and I need to track drums, I've been doing it down here and I don't know, I love it. It's a very kind of cozy room. So
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You said something earlier that I wanted to go back to, which was that, your first experience in the studio, you went to that fancy place, and yet, despite doing that, you still weren't happy with the results. And, when you were still thinking like, even though my recordings might be clipped or whatever, like my home recordings, like I still feel like those were better. And I think that's a really interesting thing to maybe touch on because, a lot of people do think that like you need that perfect room, you need all that perfect gear, whatever, the big expensive studio. Yet there was some magic in what you were doing at home, even if it wasn't like technically perfect or whatever, right?
Totally.
So what do you think it was that was the reason why you weren't happy with the results that you had at that big studio versus what you were doing at home? Like, what would you say was like that defining factor of what made it sound good?
I think to me, it was when you going to a room where everything's, you got live mics on everything and you're live tracking. I think that it was the amount of time, right? You're going in there, you're live tracking, you're doing the old school by the hour thing. So you're not really taking the time to dial tone in. But I think there's also a magic in like being able to just, blindly figuring it out just on your own or be like, okay, cool. I like the sound of this. I like the sound of that. And we're 15-year-old kids. We weren't really going to like speak up. We didn't even know what to speak up on. We're like, okay, cool. We're just excited to be here. We've never got this experience to even be in a studio. So, but I do remember just putting that CD on in the car. And then I had like a burned like CD from home, putting it back in, be like, okay, like, what is this? And I think, some of the tone choices, I remember listening back, like, I think I played through like the orange amp, looking back, was one of those like low gain, like orange blues amps, like the 80s. My other guitar player was playing through like a Fender, like it might have been like a deluxe or like a twin, something that's very clean, which, whatever I was using was probably some sort of like rocker verb or like a soldano, or I don't know if they had the soldano then, but like some sort of anthem that even made sense, you know? So I think it's just also a bit of the understanding of an artist. Like I always tell bands or artists, whoever come in all the time, I'm like, hey, I use the analogy like an Uber driver. I'm like, cool, I'm your Uber driver. We got in the car. You're telling me where you want to go, and I'm just going to get you there. And, you know, I tell people I'm as hands-on or as hands-off as you are comfortable with and want me to be. Because, you know, being in the other chair of, you know, being in a band and stuff, I always want people to feel heard, you know. And luckily to actually back to my kind of upbringing getting into this, I did later on, after I was recording a lot on my own, realize I wanted to learn more about just the recording process. I didn't have really much analog gear at home. I think I had like later on, I think I had like a Chameleon Labs preamp and then just maybe like a Warm 76 or something. So Jesse Cannon at the time had a studio up in Union City, New Jersey. I went to a band, we did an EP with him, and I remember asking him like, hey, like, dude, could I like come here and like buy you lunch and Red Bull and just watch you work? And I think that there was a lot of value even to that. Those few times I've gone up there and kind of just shadowed watching kind of like what he had done and seeing his approach versus when I was like, that experience when I was 15 was that he was a bit more hands-on with the artist. He was like, all right, you know, what do you like? Or he actually was doing producing, which is, I think, what I ended up ultimately fall in love with versus like, yes, I like to engineer. We're all nerds. We all like to touch knobs. But, you know, going there, I was like, wow, like he's diving into the songs, like, and he, you know, and like he's going through like arrangements. I really like that. That's exciting. So.
Absolutely. I think there's a couple things to take from that story. And I think that like, number one, it's like, it goes to show the importance of source tones, right? Like if you dial in the right source tones, you're going to be happy with it. Whereas like, if you just use anything, obviously, like, you know, it's a crapshoot whether or not it's going to work. And also I think there's also, it highlights the benefit of like doing things on your own and being in control of the sound because, you know, you trust a big studio and you think, oh, like, these people play with pro gear all the time. Like they're going to be the best at what they do. They're going to get me the best results. And it's like,
totally.
Yeah, someone else's skill can be like great, but if they don't share the same vision as you, you're not going to get that same result that you want. So it's so important to establish what that vision is early on so you can get those right source tones and go from there. So I think it's cool that you touched on that. And even that you got the chance to hang out with Jesse and like learn from him, I think that's awesome too. And he was a guest on the podcast as well. And he's a great dude as well. So yeah, I always love hearing like people connecting in the circle of the podcast guests.
Totally.
Yeah. But you kind of also brought up another interesting point too, which is that idea of like, you know, these days there are so many different roles in the industry. There's like, and you do a lot of them yourself. Like you do producing, you do mixing, mastering, engineering. Those lines can often be blurred these days. And I feel like there's a lot of people that are kind of doing a bit of everything, right? Or having to do everything on every project. So as far as like producing, you said that was one of the things that you really enjoy doing. Like, what do you see the role of a producer as these days?
You know, I think it can be very widespread. I think that, you know, there's some artists that I've worked with where the producer's job is almost just like, you know, if someone comes in, sometimes the song just might be great as is. And if it's having discipline to be like, okay, like, let's just get the right takes and get the right, you know, performance. Whereas other times it might be like, one of the things I love is, you know, a lot of times I work with, you know, a bit of pop artists as well as rock bands, and they'll come in with maybe they write a song on acoustic guitar and they do it over an iPhone, or they, you know, write to a YouTube beat. That's a new thing I'm seeing happen a lot. It's how do we turn this from this idea to what it is? And something I enjoy is like, we'll go in and if the artist maybe plays, you know, instruments, they'll play something, or maybe I'll play guitar or I'll play drums on it. And we kind of are basically writing it from the ground up. And I don't think that that's every producer's role. I think back to someone like Jesse, what was amazing to me is he doesn't really play. I mean, I know he plays a little bit of drums, but he's not much of a player, but he's got a really, you know, great ability of knowing like, all right, you know, like, I remember being in an experience with him and with one of my old bands, and he was like, you know what, like push the song up a half step. And to even, you know, just know that thought of, okay, this needs to be a little bit higher. And that changed the whole vibe of the song and ended up making it from the song that was probably the throwaway track to the single. And I think that that's something that's really cool, you know, and I think everyone's approach, like, you know, for me, I like to, you know, help come up with ideas and arrangements and things like that. But someone like Brett, who I work with, he does, he seems like he's really a drummer, doesn't play a little guitar, does like open chord stuff, but he's got this great ear of knowing like, all right, well, you're playing this chord here. Just what if you move that chord down a half step? And now all of a sudden you just throw this one weird chord in there and add something exciting. So I think those moments are, I think in today with things being so, I feel like you can get a good recording at home today that can go straight to Spotify. So it's like, what separates that producer from, like an engine, and there's nothing, I mean, engineering is very important too, don't get me wrong. But I think that like what separates that producer of someone having a song at home versus coming in and working with somebody, I think that having that ear, that role just kind of help guide the song and just also just go down the list and, make sure all your boxes are checked,
Yeah, of course. Well, I know that is something that you're really passionate about, is like, seeing that finish line from an iPhone demo to making it into like a full-blown production. And so I kind of want to dig a little deeper into that side of things for you. Like, as far as where you would typically start when you're working with a new artist, like what is your approach to helping them with that songwriting or producer approach? Like, where do you typically start with their demos?
So I guess it really depends. So I had an artist yesterday who I'm working with as well today. She writes her songs on just an acoustic guitar. She's got this kind of singer, songwriter, Gracie Abrams type vibe going on. And first thing I listen to is I try to focus on just the vocal and the arrangement. I try not to over listen to demos ahead of time because I could listen to a demo 3 weeks ago and then hear it now. And, I might feel something a little different about it. So I like to usually get an initial listen, and when we're in a room together and I'll hear the song and I'll think, all right, I have a mental, like subconscious checklist where I'm checking tempo, I'm checking key, I'm checking just kind of like, is this section feel too long? Does this section feel too short? Like, is this, I think, is there enough tension and release? Are things pushing and pulling in the right way? So we'll start with, laying that, hearing that. And what I like doing then is making the decision of, okay, are we doing it to a click? Which 90% of the time we're recording to a click, and we'll go in and we'll maybe build a scratch together. And after we the reason I almost do that is as we're building that scratch, we can build things around it. Okay, let's listen back. You know what? I'll put things into like Pro Tools Elastic Pro and I'll actually time stretch. So I might say, this chorus should be 1 BPM faster. Not that, and this is with pop music. It's not that this is going on with, math rock, but sometimes it's cool of like, all right, I feel like this should just feel a little bit more, that's not chaotic, but like, it feels like it should have a little bit more energy, a little more exciting. We'll maybe push the tempo up, or, what needs a little more pocket. Let's lower this section, stuff like that. And then really from there, we build. Process with bands is a little different. With bands, I like to do a live on the floor situation with demos too. Like, so first I'll say, all right, jam it like it's band practice. And, band will go play the song. We'll same thing. I'll say, all right, everyone come in and take a listen. Then we'll try it to a click. And same idea. We'll, sometimes bands have those things fleshed out already, but we'll go through, make a tempo map. And then as we're trying things, I like to just kind of playlist as we're demoing. I'll be like, all right, like as we're going into that chorus, it's a faster section. So instead of maybe doing a slower drum fill, give me something faster because, we're going there. Or, what, this part here, the halftime feels a little odd. Let's try maybe taking it at full time, like things like that. It's a lot of just trial and error. We're bouncing ideas off because I think from there, all the other, ideas, the bells and whistles that are really fun, those kind of come secondary. I think the idea of just fleshing out the actual song and making sure that if that was taken away from all the bells and whistles and just, an arrangement and a vocal and it carries something, it's a good song. So.
Yeah. So when you're doing this experimenting where you're, playing around with tempo or drum fills or whatever, would you consider this like a separate part of like the pre-production process, or are you kind of like everything that goes in is part of the final recording and we're just trying to figure out like we'll comp it later and make it into something?
That's really pre-pro for me for the most part. Sometimes with drums, what I'll do with drum tracking is I like the approach of not just tracking to a scratch guitar that was recorded to a click. I like to have that scratch guitar performance live tracked, if the full band's there, right? It's all situational, but in an ideal situation, everybody's here. You get a scratch guitar, scratch vocal, we're jamming it. Once we feel like we've got that down, I say, all right, these scratches will stay. Let's go in and now start getting drum takes. And sometimes some of those takes prior might end up making it in for drums. Usually with guitars and scratch vocal, those are kind of usually throwaway. Unless there's something that's super magical that we're like, that thing from the scratch was cool. Like sometimes even like noise, like someone will like, mess something up and there's like a weird like noise bit. I'm like, oh, that's cool. We can use that as like a feedback or something. But most of the time, guitars are I'll say 95% of the time, guitars, bass, vocals are all redone.
That makes sense. Yeah. So it sounds like some people would do pre-production just like in a separate jam space, not recording it and kind of work out all the kinks there. But you're recording that and preserving anything that's cool out of those, I don't know what you want to call it, like those experiments, I guess, of, what works. Yeah, that's cool. Hey, just want to take a quick second to tell you all about our awesome podcast sponsor, Samply, which is an app that I've been using for a while now that has made the process of mix revisions with clients so much easier. In the past, I used to get vague emails from clients about what sections needed fixing, and it was always a bit of a guessing game. But with Samply, I can upload my mixes, send my clients a link to a playlist where they can listen losslessly, and then they can add timestamped comments directly on the files. I can then import these notes into my DAW and have them perfectly synced up to my session. So there's no more guessing. Another feature that I love is their playlist embedding. Right now on my website, I have a lossless playlist of my portfolio so that any potential client can hear my work at full quality. No more crappy sounding, low resolution MP3 files. Instead, people can hear my work at its best. And the icing on the cake? Samply integrates with a ton of different services. And one of my favorite integrations is their integration with SoundFlow. With just one click, Samply can export my mix from my DAW, upload it to Samply, and then send my clients an email for where they can hear their song. One button, that's all it takes. It's a major time saver. So Samply has really streamlined my workflow, and I know that they can do it for you too. So make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And you can get 3 months off any Samply plan for free by simply applying the coupon code MYM at checkout. Yeah, and so you kind of touched on a couple of little things that you're listening for in the demo. Like you talked about vocals definitely being a big one and like the arrangement. And you talked about maybe things like tempo or key or, like just little cool bits in the track. But like, is there anything else that you're listening for in a demo or like maybe, I guess maybe a better way of asking it is like, are there mistakes that you often hear people doing in their initial versions of their songs? Like, common things that you see coming up time and time again that you're paying attention to a little bit more when you listen to a demo.
Totally. I think that one thing I notice a lot is that I think people try to, depending on, genre, right? But I feel like generally when I'm working with pop, a lot of times people get married to the intro verse, pre-chorus, chorus, structure, which, is a tried and true, right? That works. But I think sometimes when people are doing that, sometimes that chorus is just, that first chorus could just be half as long, you don't need to give the whole thing right away. So I noticed like this structure, I think sometimes people think it needs to be a certain way. Or with bands, sometimes it's the opposite. They think, okay, cool, we need this big jam section. And sometimes that works. Like I'm a huge fan of like Teenage Fan Club, and that record Bandwagon Nest, that first song on that record is 7 minutes long. So it's very like, also what something like Oasis would do, right? Like, but the first half of the song structured so pop. It's like, and then after that chorus, you've got this big like Pink Floyd moment where it just goes on and it never comes back. And I think that's so interesting to me. I think it's just like, wow, like they took this song that's just power pop, bit, and then they just went total scene change for the rest of the song. And that's what makes it cool. I mean, there's songs that are, can feel like 2 minutes that are 7.5 minutes long, and songs that are 2 minutes that can feel like 8 because it's just like, all right, get it over with. So I don't worry so much about song lengths. I don't worry so much about, following traditional structure as long as it makes me feel something, and I think that those are things I think that people don't look into as much as really like, I think that they think, okay, this needs to be this long. Everything needs to be linear, 4 bars, or they have no idea of structure. So I think just like paying attention to that is important, because a lot of times people have really good ideas for melodies and they have really good ideas for, his parts. It's just sometimes where to place them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I like what you said there about like not paying attention to like the length of the song. Like, I think that's a really important thing. And maybe that stems a lot from like the old radio days, because it used to be like, everything had to be like 3 minutes or whatever. And so people were just so focus on like the end time of the song as opposed to like what's actually happening. And I agree that I think like when you have cool sections, it doesn't feel like it's 5 minutes or 7 minutes or whatever it is,
Totally.
And I guess it also kind of depends too on like what is the focus or what's the goal of the song or the band, right? If it is to get on radio, maybe you do have to consider those things, but like it still has to be an entertaining song, and don't just look at the final number of the track length or whatever, right?
Totally. Absolutely. I think, there's really no one size fits all in it. And I think that that's what's really cool. Like you said, what you said right there about like, the artist's goal, like, is it, if the goal is cool, I want to make the next TikTok song, and you're cool, let's find that TikTok moment for you. But sometimes it just, I think, thinking about it from a outside of studio corporate standpoint, sometimes it does kind of get in the way of people's creativity a bit. And it's very probably said over and over again, right? But like, I think if you make the music you want to make in the studio, we can't predict anything else, right? Like I've seen, I'm sure you've seen as well, like artists that have had maybe like, 10 monthly listeners, has a song goes viral on TikTok that was the intro of their record, and now they've got 1 million monthlies. Or you can go and have a situation where, you make a song that feels like the greatest song in the studio. You're like, wow, this song really changed me. But for whatever reason, maybe it just wasn't released on the right day, and then that didn't happen and it didn't catch. But at the end of the day, you can walk out of that studio, walk out of that session being like, damn, like I made something that, meant something to me. It feels awesome. And I think that's like why we all do this, right? Like it's, at least for me, it's like why I fell in love with this is just being able to be a part of like, we're working with people's dreams. And I think that's so sick.
For sure. I totally agree with that. I think that you have to be excited by the music you're making. Like, I'm sure there are songwriters out there who it is like very formulaic and strategic and whatnot. And hey, if that's like what gets you going, then great. But like to me, I'm with you. Like I think you got to walk out of it feeling excited. I would argue too that I think there's a lot of great songwriters out there that end up having that one hit and end up thinking like, oh shit, like now I got to make more of that hit. And it like distracts from like how they wrote that initial hit. And, that initial hit was like, I got a feeling and it feels great. And then everything else just like changes afterwards. And you're just trying to fit a mold, which can be really restrictive. So yeah, I think I agree. I'm totally with you on that. You just have to feel the song and be excited by what you're making.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one other thing that like I was curious to dig into as far as like those demos is that like, I think as producers, as songwriters, engineers, whatever, we can often hear a song and immediately start to think about like, oh, this would sound cooler if we had different lyrics or a different arrangement or different parts or whatever. Kind of everything we've been talking about there. But that said, there's a lot of artists that have demo-itis and they've heard their songs a million times. And so they become so married to the way it is that they can have a hard time seeing it any other way. So how do you approach that idea of making changes and, trying to serve the song or getting an artist to see a different perspective as opposed to like, I know you like your song, like, this is going to be the way it is, right?
Yeah. I think to me, it's like having the bedside manner of it's important, knowing like, hey, like, this is someone spends a lot of time, especially people who have like really well thought out demos. Like, because sometimes I'll get demos where like maybe someone in the band's like an engineer or producer, and they went in and they really, really dialed into onto like the fine combing of it all. Like they're adding like risers and all these other layers, whereas it's like, that's great, that's cool. You really took the time to think that out, and that has to be noticed. But what I'll even do is say, hey, like, let's listen to your demo. Let's listen to it together. What do we like about it? And let's make up an example here. Let's say that I hear the song and something about the bridge isn't just hitting right. Let's just to use that for an example. It's like, you can tell that like, there's something about this bridge that, the artist is stuck on. I always tell them, hey, like, let's always try everything. We can always go back. We can always go back and do your thing. And at the end of the day, I think artist has the final say. Like, I don't feel the need or the ego to be like, oh, it's my way. I think that, there are, producers who say, hey, you're coming to me for what I do and we're going to do it this way. And that's why you're coming here. And I get that. But for me, I think it's like hey, let's try everything. And I think that building that trust is super important, right? Like if you go into it with an artist and you're just more or less like, feeling like, okay, I need this band to listen to me. You're not, they're not going to feel heard, and they're not going to have the trust in you. Like, that's going to be the band that's going to be sending you a million mix notes or yada yada. Whereas, like, I think that if you establish, and also hearing like, what does that artist like and not, the first question I ask an artist is, what do you like and not like in a song, right? Because I think back to that day of being like, again, 15, going to that studio, and you're like, oh, we're a pop punk band. And he's like, oh, like the Ramones or like the Fall Out Boys, where, to me, it was just an age difference. An older guy who, is into older rock. And I've actually like gone back and have listened to some things that, he's done, later on. I'm like, oh, cool. You know what? If I was like doing like a totally different genre of music, that would have worked. But where that may have not worked is the understanding, right? And it's like, for example, now in my life, I won't take on like types of projects that I feel like I won't have a connection with. Like I'd rather pass it on to someone I think we do a better job. Like I don't do like a lot of like trap music for the sake of I don't understand the nuances that someone who loves and is really into that music's into. And I'd say, hey, I've got a friend of mine who's great. He's going to do a better job. Go to him. But yeah, I guess back to the demo-itis thing. I think it just like comes back to trust and knowing what someone likes and doesn't like. Like if I am hearing this as the way I would like something, then is that really suiting the artist, right? Is it really suiting the song? Like I might think of things that I'll tell them, hey, this is how this makes me feel and here's why. But at the end of the day, this makes you feel something different and you want this day, then we're going to go that way. And that's totally cool.
Of course. Yeah, and I think you touched on a really important thing there, which is that conversation that you have to have with a band in terms of like, what is it that you like? Where do you want to go with this? Because you could argue that maybe if that engineer that you worked with when you were 15, if they had those same conversations with you, they may have realized, oh, wait a minute, this band wants to go in a different direction than what I think. And then that can drastically change the trajectory of everything. I think that is a really important thing. Like, even if you're not producing a band, even if you're just mixing a band, it's like, I always ask people, like, what do you want this to sound like? Who are your influences? Because there's been times where I've like, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but like there was one band I remember recording who, I thought they sounded like Green Day. And, I was pulling up Green Day references and they're like, we fucking hate Green Day. Yeah. And they were like, we like Alkaline Trio, which is like, same, sure, well, let's call it punk music, whatever. But it's like, stylistically, they're different. And mix-wise, they sound different. Frequency-wise, they're different. So it's like, finding that direction from the artist to figure out like, this is where they want to go. And then catering to that as opposed to just fueling your own personal style. Sometimes that's what people come to you for. And they'll tell you that. But other times you have to respect their vision for it and make that happen.
Yeah. And even like you said about the understanding, like the Green Day and Alkaline, it's like same thing. It's like they're, one record, you have those, CLA mixes on like an American Idiot, whereas some of these other like punk records that might have came out of like Blasting Room or something, it's, some things are a little bit more loose and there's a bit more push, a bit more rub. And I think that's like the same way as like, if I have a band that's a bit more jammy and we want things a bit more I might not edit as much. I might do just big macro nudges. Whereas like if I've got someone who is like loves like, I don't know, like a top 40 like band that's really, really like, I'm gonna go in. I'm gonna start comping every guitar chord and doing all the micros. So it's really situational.
Of course. So kind of on the opposite end of what we talked about with demo-itis, because demo-itis people often, they're set in their ways, and I feel like a lot of times it has to do with like people layering a lot of tracks. They're just committed to like how much work they've done to it. On the opposite end of that, like you'll get people who sometimes will come to you with like a really bare bones song where it might just be like a vocal or a guitar or something like that, and maybe they want it to become this like full blown production. Are those the kind of projects that you'll often take on as an engineer or songwriter?
I love projects like that. I know some people, some friends of mine, they prefer like an artist really hash things out. To me, it's like, I think it's cool because I think that the creativity time clock kind of could start ticking, right? Like it's good to obviously put the time in, put the work in. And I do long days too. I do the 12, 14-hour day thing. I'll start at like, maybe like at 10 a.m. and I'll go till, 11 o'clock at night, 12 midnight. I think that sometimes you go in and you're in on something, you're inspired. Whereas like if, we chilled out a demo and you've been demoing that song for months, you're going to feel a lot less excited about that song 6 months down the line because you've heard it a bunch of times. It's like the first time you hear one of your favorite songs and you're like, wow, I love this song. And then it might not have that same feeling that you did the first time you listened to it. So I try to like ride off of that high with people a bit. And I feel like I've noticed artists get excited when they didn't see their song a certain way. Like maybe, they're like, cool, I love, Chapel Roan or something. And then you're like, oh, well, I'll sometimes pull up like, all right, that Chapel Roan song reminds me of this ABBA song. And then like, we can maybe do this kind of cool, like key change thing. Like, whoa, like I didn't think of, that. You're building off of like something that started as they thought of it one way. And now you're showing like that artist they liked influences and you're inspired and you're just kind of bouncing back and forth versus like, I think that having the finished demos, great. I think that's totally cool. And I think there's a lot to work with there, and it's how do we make this better? Like we've already got 60 to 70% of the way there. How do we get the next 20 to 30? Whereas like when you got a pretty clean slate, you're kind of riding that adventure together. And I think that's, to me, I personally find it really exciting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like personally for me, like I kind of hate those projects just because like I don't consider myself like I'm not really a guitar player. Like I can hear notes and like direct people in a direction. I do feel like if you're going to take on those kind of projects, you have to feel comfortable playing a lot of different instruments, right? And I'm assuming you do as well, right?
Yeah, I play guitar, drums, keys. It's funny when I drum, I play open-handed, so I look extra goofy. Yeah, that's usually a lot of the things. Or if it's a project where there's an instrument like I don't play or I don't feel confident enough, I'll call someone in. Like I've got a string player who rules. That if I ever need like real strings, I call him up. I'm like, Gabe, like I need you to play strings on this, But
yeah. So I guess in those cases, it's like, yeah, if you can play all the instruments, and then that's amazing. If you're someone like me, then like having other people around that can play those parts is like always key because, you can go bank on the creativity of others. But yeah, it's kind of exciting because like, I do see what you're saying there. Like where if someone has already developed their song so much and they've spent all the time with it, then like, yeah, it's like they've heard it before. Whereas if you're starting from scratch, there's so many different directions you can take it in. And I'm assuming that you still have to be having a lot of those same kind of conversations with the artist in terms of like, what do we want this to sound like? How developed is this going to be? Like kind of get a sense of like where they want you to take their songs, right?
Absolutely. And it's, it's a lot of conversation beforehand. We listen to like, all right, like, what are we feeling with this song? Like, and, sometimes an artist might have been say, hey, cool, I wanted to get, a little louder, a little energetic, a little whatever. Or, it might be a situation where they say, hey, I want it to be, pretty organic and pretty like bare bones. And it's also that having the discipline, whereas like I can go and add like 100 tracks to something, or we can say, you know what, like, let's just throw some mics up. This might just be a guitar and vocal song. And, like that, for example, like I'll Follow You Into the Dark by Death Cab. It's probably the biggest song on that record. That's a mono recording. Whereas, there's other songs on that record that've got tons of tracks going on, and, there's a lot going on. So yeah, it's about, I guess to me, like, a lot of conversation beforehand and where are we going to take this? And also along the way, I always ask like, hey, do you like this? Do you hate this? Like, how do you feel about this? And it's good to kind of keep like asking those questions. And I tell people too, I'm like, hey, I will never be offended if you tell me like you don't like an idea. Like, I'd rather know that and know where to take it, or where we can take it. So,
yeah. Well, again, it all really comes down to like just everyone being on the same page of the vision of where it's going. And I think that Death Cab analogy is like a good one too. And it's like kind of reminds you that sometimes you just have to focus on like what's serving the song in the best way. And sometimes that is just like the simplest way of doing it. And maybe, an artist comes into the session expecting that it's going to be this like, I don't know, giant Coldplay production or something like that. And then you're like, nope, this demo is perfect. Let's keep this,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's always fun too. And like, cause then like, you get that sometimes artists like, really? I'm like, yeah, like, I'm like, come in, like, let's just like listen to this, you take it in. Like, and sometimes like too, like, like, oh, well, there's like imperfections and I'm like, and sometimes those are like things that are not right in those demo moments just feel cool, like, obviously when things sound wrong and they're wrong, right? But like, I sometimes just like, okay, cool, there is a little bit of bleed, or maybe there was that hand swipe or something, but maybe that added something that was really interesting to the song and added a human element. That's not for everything, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, there's often that magic in there, like, yeah, a little hand swipe or whatever it is that, like, you hear that and you're like, oh, that sounds awesome. Like voice cracks. Like I love when I get that kind of stuff in productions. It's like, this just shows you're feeling it, let's keep this. It's raw. It's like, it sounds like a human. It doesn't always need to be perfect and
Totally.
like so polished, right? So yeah, I think that's cool. As far as like doing those kind of sessions where you're building songs from the ground up with people, are you kind of just taking like a songwriting cut with those kind of things? Or like, how do you approach like the business side of like those kind of sessions? Is it just like people are still coming in and paying you for a song rate as normal, or?
So it's a little bit of both. So it's like, how I usually do it is if I'm writing the song with them, right? If I'm sitting there and we're writing a song from the ground up, then I'll take points as well. But like if we're doing, like if someone comes in, they have a song written and I'm just kind of helping build it. I always think of it from back to just being in a band of like, hey, you know what? Like ultimately you're going to go out, you've got to tour on it. You've got to pay for any kind of marketing. Once you leave the studio, like my job is done. I think that yes, that if I was part of that process and I helped you write it, then yes, a point or two is cool if I'm part of the writing process. But if I'm producing, I just have my, my manager handles like all kind of like my rates and stuff for me. And I try to keep it where, hey, I understand, especially with solo artists too, obviously we have to all get paid. We all are working, but I understand as well, like, hey, when you got a solo artist in, it's a lot different than having a band, right? Like a solo artist, they're merging artists versus, I have a major label artist come in and major labels got a very different budget. Like, I'll work with it. Let's figure it out. Like, how do we get you here? So that way when, if I get you on, EP1, that when LP2 comes around, there is a bigger budget and we can make this happen. Like, we can spend more time on this and do this. So.
No, I think it's important to cover that just because, there is like kind of like what we talked about earlier, there is that like fine line between like what is the role of a producer versus a songwriter versus an engineer and all that kind of stuff. So like really getting clear on what that is when you start a project is always helpful so that, people feel like they got what they're entitled to or what they're worth, right? So yeah, I think it's one of those things too where like if you're putting in all that work, you don't want to like spring that up on someone at the end of the day and be like, hey, so now that we did this, like I'm taking all my money,
Exactly. I have it all ahead of time before you step foot in the studio, do deposit anything. Like, hey, what are we doing? And this is what it's going to be. So that way it's not like, oh, surprise, there's a mix to this. I'm like, this is, if you're getting everything all in, this is what it is. And that's, that covers everything. I don't charge performance fees or anything like, or for this extra thing or that extra thing. You're getting me for the day or the week or month or whatever it is. And this is what it is. And and then, if I'm writing the songs with you from the ground, like we're going in and I'm helping you come up with the top lines and lyrics and stuff, then there'll be points too. Right. But I'm not going to take points for playing guitar on something. At least personally. I mean, people do. And I don't see anything wrong with that. For me, I'm like, if I'm already charging you, I don't really see the need to throw an extra double down on that, That's part of like my price, I guess,
Yeah. And again, that all just comes down to having that conversation ahead of time so people know what to expect. Yeah. Now, you work on a lot of different styles of music, and I think that's really cool. And as a songwriter, that's got to be really refreshing for you to like be able to experiment with so many different styles and whatnot. But that said, like, some people would make the argument that it's hard to get good at one style alone.
For sure.
So for you being the type of person that works on so many different styles, like how do you keep on top of different musical trends or even just making sure that your skills are up to par for all those different styles that you work on?
So for me, at the end of the day, I try to have it be like these are the things I like and don't like broadband with all modern music, right? I do a lot of work with my friend John Marks in the past couple of years. He's been having me help out on some projects. He works with a lot of hardcore bands, a lot of punk, a lot of hardcore, some pop punk stuff. Like we did that Story So Far record, but where I feel like in sessions like that, where he kind of gets a bit of the you said in me, where I kind of am trying in those sessions is I'm playing a lot of keys and doing a lot of the synth, a lot, like production on some of these songs where it could be like, again, like a really aggressive hardcore band, but like, cool. He's John's a bit of, in the best way, like a maximalist. Like he loves just a lot of just like, he'll put 30 mics on, on a kit, like that kind of whole bit. But he'll be like, all right, like even with, all right, like double, let's go in, double up these kick drums with like some, room impacts and stuff. And I'm going in and I'm just doing like those type of things the way I would work on a pop record. And they couldn't be more opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of, music. And I guess too, keeping up, I do listen to a lot of music. I know some people do the thing where they go in, and I'll go back and I will listen to playlists, right? Like what people do, but I try to just find not just new music I like and keep up to date. Like I would see, okay, like I'm noticing now people are losing a bit of that fat snare that was cool in 2017, 2018. And now it's mixes. I feel like you're getting a little bit less loud. They're getting a little brighter. The snares are a little bit more snappy. People really like a superphonic, I do think that that's kind of broadband, but I think as well, I go back to records I love time and time again. Like, and some records that are new, sometimes I'll hear something that comes out and like, oh, this reminds me of this record that came out, 10, 20, 30 years ago. Like, I'll hear like that MG Lenderman record that just came out. I've been listening to a lot. They Get Records, awesome. To me, it reminds me of like Ben Queller. Like, I remember like hearing that, like they like the OC and, a lot of those like, early 2000s bands are having influence on like pop punk and emo bands. Like I'll hear some of these bands coming out on like Pure Noise and stuff. And I'm like, wow, like this reminds me a lot of like, Fountains of Wayne, or like I'm hearing even like, what's that band? Oh my God, it's killing me. It's on Lower Pinback. I feel like I'm hearing so much of like the Pinback type stuff, even in some of these bands. And the kids now, like, it's crazy. Like I'm the oldest of 5 kids in my family, and my youngest brother, he's 11 years younger than me. He's 20. And he's like, I was like at my parents' house the other day visiting, and he's like listening to Deftones. I'm like, I forgot like all the kids were like that age now, like love like Deftones and nu metal and shoegaze, like Mazzy Star is somehow like really cool. So like, I never want to also be like the old guy who like is the back in my day guy. I think that there is something cool to see like where music grabs influences even 20, 30 years later. Yeah, that's kind of my way of kind of keeping up on it. I find something I like. I'll sometimes go back to a record that maybe influenced that and think like, oh, like how did this evolve? That's cool. So
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. It's like music is kind of a cyclical thing, and like, what is cool now will not be cool in like 5 years, but in 20 years, it'll come back again. So it's like, it kind of works that way. And so, constantly looking back at the inspirations of our favorite artists, I think that can really reveal where things can head. Just like a band that I love, like Blink, like their latest record has like tons of synths on it, and they have a song called Blink Wave on it, and it's like, it's kind of a synth wave kind of track. And it's like, okay, well, you can go back to the 80s and hear like where that kind of originated from. And you're starting to hear even more of that in like music that's coming out now too. So it is definitely like a helpful exercise, I think, to go back to some of those older productions and see like what's working here. And also, you talked about how like snares are getting a little bit thinner. I'm like, I love that thick snare drums. Like that's kind of like, to me, that's like where my heart is as a drummer, yeah. Right? But like, you're right. Like, when you start to then think about like, okay, well, if we're going towards this like kind of like 80s or early 90s kind of track, they had a little bit of a thinner sound then, like it might still been like low tuned, but it was a thinner, didn't have like the 200 hertz in there, so you kind of learn to adapt your production style based on some of those older trends, and you can kind of see where things are moving. So yeah, I think that's a cool exercise, just going back through those old influences.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's funny even with like you said, the snare. I feel like my biggest issue always whenever I mix, I notice I feel like everyone's got their one thing that they go back and they feel like they're guilty of. And me, it's always a loud snare. I feel like I'll always go back and listen to shit. My snare is like mega loud. And I think I love like that fat, but I think now I'm having the discipline of, all right, like this is like kind of like how like fashion, like, people were wearing things differently 5-10 years ago. Like, trends kind of go out. I'm like, all right, I might still like some of those things, but I'll adapt. And they said, pulling out the 200 or even just sometimes just pulling it volume down a little bit. Like, I feel like they're just not as, snares just haven't been as loud, Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that like a big part of it is if you want to keep up, you have to be listening to references as you're working, and you have to kind of just see where is the direction of things. And when an artist comes to you saying they want to sound like a certain other artist, it's like you have to be listening to those mixes as you go along, and like listen for the frequency balance or the vocal or the volume balance, or maybe even panning decisions or something like that. Like that that can make a big impact as well. So just keeping on top of that music and using it as references, I think, is a really important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Even too, when I mix, I try not to go in and just do the thing where I'm copying someone else's mix. What I'll do is I use Metric AB.
It's my favorite plugin.
Yeah, it's the best plugin in the world. Put it right after my limiter. And usually I have this kind of a folder of just kind of like tracks I love in a certain, for each genre, like rock, pop, indie, metal, hardcore. And they'll be from totally different, like, producers and mixers. Because like, I know, like, even actually, I think I have one of those Blink songs in there, funny enough, on the new record. Because like that record is funny. Guitars are really low, I feel like, and the drums are just right up there and very just super hyper compressed. But then I'll go in and maybe have something that was done by like, I don't know, I'm trying to think about like pop punk stuff I've got in there. Like I might have something from like Will Putney in there where, and then I might have something else from, it's not like a Sullivan mix, but like some stuff that Brett did. And I noticed like, Brett might have a louder kick drum. John might have, his guitar's a little bit more forward. Like, but at the end of the day, I listen like, okay, overall, how's my low end? Overall, how's my upper mids? Am I super bright? Am I like, sticking out like a sore thumb here? Like, does something feel wrong? And then that's kind of my way of kind of doing, but it's the best. Like I fully love, that plugin.
Yeah, it is by far my favorite plugin of all time. Just it's so useful, and it's something that like when you just tell people it's like a plugin for references, most people would just be like, "Why do I need that?" But there's so much cool stuff that's involved in that plugin, and I think it's just such a helpful plugin when you dig into the weeds with it.
Of course.
Cool. So then, like at the end of the day, when it comes to like songwriting, we've talked a lot about songwriting here, and like just different ways that you approach it from a writer's perspective, and also how you even infuse that into like your mixing side of things. What do you consider to be a great song at the end of the day?
A great song to me is just something that it's going to sound very, very like generic to say, like, it makes me feel something, but I think it takes me on a journey, right? It's like, I can go and hear like a really cool, like, let's say it's like a hardcore song. And I'm like, wow, like this song just gets me really hyped up. Like it's got this great energy. Like, whenever like it drops into that like one moment, oh, damn, like this, like it really, it has this heavy, feel. Whereas like, when I be a pop song, like, oh, this is really dancey, or like, it could be an emotional song where, and I do work with people on lyrics too, but a lot of times I try not to tell people what to say, but unless I'm getting words out of it and helping them get there with it. I do pay attention to lyrics. I think sometimes just like, I don't know, when something feels different, I guess everyone creates what they consume, but when something just feels like, not that they just stole something from someone, but they actually had reinvented it into their own thing, I think that's super cool. So, I mean, it's kind of broadband, but I would say something that just really makes you feel some way,
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think that's all really good stuff. Like that's what people need to focus on, is just like, how does it make you feel? And, I guess we could have gone into the conversation of like, when we talked about how to help people with refining their songs, like sometimes that does involve lyric changes and stuff. But other times you have to kind of also just focus on like, what do these lyrics mean to that person?
Yeah.
Because like we might want to try to steer them in a certain direction because we think it makes a song poppier or whatever you want to call it, right? But like other times, like those songs, those lyrics mean something. And then if you can really tap into that, you can get those great performances out of it. And then people feel that song even more as a result of it.
Yeah. Even too, like, like what you said about like, I try to really focus on what people say, because sometimes they say something like, and you listen to a song and you're like, wow, when you said that, like, I almost want to hear you say it again. Now that might introduce a whole new section of the song. It might be like a background vocal call, or it might just be like, wow, like, how do we make that moment when you said this thing really emphasize, And I think that's something that's very, very important. Like, sometimes it's so easy to get caught up in like melody and thinking about like just the sonics and timbre of it. But like when you go down and like listen to what someone was just saying from like the poetic part, it's like, how do we bring out that? And like, how do we also make sure we're not overstepping the vocal? Or sometimes just like someone's not saying a lot. Sometimes songs say nonsense, and that's also kind of okay and fun. Like I love Weed, those are just goofy songs, but like, then it's like, all right, they're saying nonsense. How do we make it sound nonsensical? Right. So.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think you brought up a cool point there too, of just like, paying attention to how to like bring out more of like what the lyrics are kind of touching on. And it reminded me of like there's a song by At the Drive-In that I love. I honestly I can't remember the name right now, but there's a lyric that is like dancing on the corpse's ashes, and like the song was about, I think it was like the singer's mom dying or something. At that part of the song, like they break down to this like drum beat where like the producer was like, well, if it's about like life and death, like we gotta like let's make it a heartbeat. So the kick drum's like kind of doing like a heartbeat thing going on, and it's like such a small detail that most people aren't gonna notice, but it's like it helps like kind of tie together the lyrics and the music a little bit better, and that just creates this cool unique feel that some people will gravitate towards, even if it's subconscious. Yeah,
totally.
That's awesome, man. Well, dude, I don't want to take up much more of your time, but if people want to learn more about you, potentially even work with you, reach out to you, that kind of thing, like what's the best way for them to do that?
My Instagram is just rob.chiarappa, which is my last name is a very long Italian New Jersey last name, which is CHIARAPPA. And then just, if they want to reach out to me on there, or just my email is just my name at Gmail, robchiarappa@gmail. That's the best way to reach out. So
awesome, man. Well, thanks again for doing this. Really appreciate it. This was great to learn more about your approach.
Thanks.
So that was my conversation with Rob Chiarappa, and I really enjoyed learning more about how he approaches working with other artists and making sure that their vision is fulfilled. I think that is such a big thing to cover because, like Rob shared in his story, like if a band comes to you and they don't get the sound that they hear in their head to come out of the speakers, and you're the one responsible for that, that sucks. Nobody wants to work with people like that. So it's always about figuring out, how do you make the sound that is in your head come out of those speakers? And having conversations with artists to figure out, what is the direction that you want to go with this? What kind of guitar sounds do you want? What kind of drum sounds do you want? Bass sounds, vocals, all that kind of stuff. Like, what are the elements of your production that are going to ultimately make the song come together in the way that you expect it to? And whether you're the producer or you're just working on your own material, this is such a crucial part of the puzzle that I think a lot of people don't focus enough on. And as a result, they kind of throw things together and see what sticks. And that is such a dangerous way of working, because when you don't really have a clear goal, or you can't see what that goalpost is, then how do you know that you've actually achieved it, right? And how do you know that you're making the right decisions along the way? I think that that's where a lot of people, especially in the home studio, will go wrong, is that they just have no concept of where they want a track to go. So they start trying different plugins and trying different tones and all sorts of stuff. And then at the end, they're like, that doesn't sound as good as I expected it to. That's a very dangerous trap. So it is super critical to get clear on what that vision is early on so that you can make the right decisions along the way. And in fact, that is something I really focus on a lot inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, where I'm working with my students to figure out, what is it that you like about music production these days? Do you want something that sounds modern? Do you want something that sounds old? Do you want something that has a high gain guitar or a clean guitar? All that kind of stuff. There's a lot of factors that go into it. And the clearer you can get early on, again, the easier everything's going to be. So inside of my coaching program, I work really closely with my students to help them come up with this vision for their projects before we hit record. And then we talk about the entire process from recording, editing, and mixing based on fulfilling that vision and making decisions all the way throughout, so that we know when we've hit that mark and when we're done. That is such a key thing, because I want you to look back at your productions and feel like you weren't guessing along the way, and instead you had intention, and that you were able to actually fulfill that goal in your mind of what your music should sound like. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details on that page there. I'd love to hop on a call with you. I'd love to learn more about your goals, your processes, what's working for you, what's not working for you, to see if I can truly help you, because I only work with people in this program who I truly believe I can help. And if that seems like you, then I'd love to talk about having you in the program, talk about what that looks like. And if it's not a good fit for you, I'll let you know too. Again, I'm only interested in working with people who I truly believe I can help. So once again, if you are interested in learning more about that, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude. And yeah, let's talk about how to make that vision come to life. Because as Rob talked about in this episode today, it's such a crucial part of that process. And every decision you make throughout has to be based on that. So yeah, I love everything that Rob had to talk about today, and hopefully you found that helpful. And if you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And one last shout out that I want to give before we wrap up this episode is to Samply. When it comes to working with other artists, it is so important to be optimized with your workflow and to be able to streamline the process. And Samply absolutely does that when it comes to mix revisions and helping people collaborate together and share notes, all that kind of stuff. So make sure to go check them out online at samply.app. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.